So hello, everybody. Good morning to those in Berlin, and in this time zone, good evening to those listening to us from Hong Kong, like Stefan Auer. My name is Jana Poljerin. I'm ECFR's office head in Berlin and a senior policy fellow, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to what is our first Europe debates event. So with this new kind of series of events, we want to discuss controversial issues in a straightforward but also a respectful way. This is part of our Reshape Europe initiative and jointly organized or kind of supported by Stiftung Mercator. And for our opening debate, I think we couldn't have chosen a better topic than a discussion about the rule of law in Poland. So in early October, Poland's Constitutional Court openly challenged the legal order of the EU by ruling that the Polish constitution takes precedence over some fundamental parts of the EU law. Many experts and politicians have since criticized the verdict or spoken out in favor of it. And there are basically two arguments. One argument says, this is not only about Poland, this is about a deeper problem. This is about the superiority of European law versus national law. And basically, we have seen a trend of Brussels and the European Court of Justice of self-empowerment. And there is a reason why member states like Poland think that Brussels has expanded its powers beyond previously agreed limits. That's one line of argument that we often heard. And the other argument says, no, the Polish case is really different. There is no longer an independent judiciary in the country. The Polish case is threatening to undermine the legal order of the entire EU. And there is basically there is no claim that Poland can make. We will debate this for the next hour, whether Poland has a point in this dispute, yes or no. And we'll start the debate with two great experts in a minute. But before, we are interested to learn what you think about all of this and whether you think, yes, Poland has a point in this debate, or whether you think no, Poland doesn't. So we will do a quick polling exercise now. If you are for the motion, so you will see a pop-up window and a question quite straightforward. Does Poland have a point? So is there an argument that can be made in favor of Poland? Would you think we cannot just dismiss kind of the Polish claims outright? Then please vote agree. If you think no, that's not the case, then vote disagree. And if you are still not sure, which of course you can be, then okay. And I just realized that we cannot vote, which is good. So I'm a neutral moderator. Okay, while you're voting, I would like to introduce our two speakers. They have been arguing about all of this actually quite prominently in their writings. And on Twitter, you can find both of them on Twitter, but also there is a Chatham House article written by Stefan Auer, together with two co-authors, and Gerald has published also a hell of a lot in recent years on this issue. So you will find their arguments also in writing. And I'm delighted that both of them agreed to join us. I welcome Stefan Auer, who's the Jean Monnet Chair and Associate Professor at the University of Hong Kong. Stefan later will speak for the motion and thinks, yes, Poland has a point. And I'm equally delighted to welcome Gerald Knaus, who is the founding chairman of the European Stability Initiative, a think tank based in Berlin. And Gerald thinks, no, Poland has no point. And this is what we are going to do now. We'll start with opening statements, 6 minutes. I'll set the time. I'll keep control and be very strict. And then we will start a Q&A session. So, but first I would like to, as a precondition, a starting condition, I would like to share kind of the result of our first polling that both speakers now need to speak against. So 27% of our listeners think, yes, Poland has a point. They agree with the motion. So they are Camp Stefan. 58% of our listeners think Poland doesn't have a point. They are Camp Gerald, and 15% don't know yet. And we start with Stefan. And please, Stefan, tell us why Poland has a point, and you have 6 minutes straight. Please go.
Thanks, Jana, for your kind introduction, and thanks for this opportunity. My job should be easy. Of course, it is to argue that Poland has a point. I'm not about to argue that, its government is perfect, that it is right in all respects. It simply has a point, a simple task. But Poland, or to be more specific, the Polish government right now has very few friends. So my task is indeed very onerous. And many of you, as we just found out, think that I'm on the wrong side of the story, or in fact, you might think that I'm on the wrong side of history. Not so. Poland has a point in defending its sovereignty, its independence, and the right of its people to determine how and by whom they want to be governed. Let me start by a short quote. Why do Germans think they can teach Poles what democracy is? And I'm quoting Wolfgang Schäuble, a great European and a distinguished German politician. He asked that question in an interview in Politico earlier this year. Not all Germans listened, of course. Think of Katharina Barley, a social democratic member of the European Parliament and a former minister in Merkel's government, who suggested a few weeks ago that the rule of law mechanism should be deployed right now against Poland. And she suggested that Poland should be starved of funds, aushungern. Wir sollen Poland aushungern lassen. An awful formulation, of course, as everyone aware of German and Polish history would know. And of course, this is done to help Poland, or the people of Poland, to save the Polish people from themselves. Such fantasies of salvation, I put to you, are exceedingly unhelpful. They will not attain the desired outcome, and the legitimacy is highly questionable. First, punitive measures are likely to strengthen the very political forces which they are directed against, these insular, nationalist, anti-EU forces that rule Poland. Second, they will further undermine the credibility of the European Union and exacerbate its own rule of law crisis. And here comes my key proposition. It's a simple one. Both things can be right. There are serious and justified concerns about the rule of law in Poland. I'm not denying that. Remember, I'm just arguing that Poland has a point. And there are serious and justified concerns about the rule of law in the EU. That's the important dimension I want you to focus on. Ignoring the latter, as many of my distinguished colleagues attempt to do, will not help in solving the former, quite the opposite. And to be sure, Poland has contributed to Europe's problems. But it did not create them. Poland did not create the EU's rule of law crisis. It exacerbated the tensions that characterized the EU's legal system from its inception, from its very beginning. And they intensified, of course, over the last decade, when entire countries were subjected to the EU's economic diktat, right? Many of the emergency measures taken over the last decade undermined Europe as a community of law, so much so that my co-author Nicole Cicluna, who published on EU constitutionalism, wrote about integration through disintegration of law. This is the characteristic feature of crisis emergency Europe that we have seen over the last decade. So while preceding the rule of peace, the Prawo a Sprawiedliwość party, the rule of the Justice and Law Party in Poland. Though, of course, more often than not, this wasn't the EU that they did. It was new institutions standing outside of the EU's existing legal order. But all these steps undermined the EU's rule of law. Think of Troika and the way it dealt with Greece. Think of Mario Draghi, who called the shots at the height of the Eurozone crisis. Now, Poland, of course, is not in the Eurozone and it's not getting in anytime soon. And Poland is also not about to leave the EU, but Poland is right to raise some fundamental questions about European unity. Poland is right to question what the future of the EU ought to be. What is an appropriate relationship, for example, between the EU and its member states, which is one of the consequences of the decision of the tribunal. What is the relationship between their constitutional orders and who is ultimately in charge of whose constitution? That is one of the points that this crisis triggered by the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal basically raised. Does the EU even have a constitution? It's far from clear whether that is the case. And don't tell me that these questions do not matter. They do. They are in fact vital. It is the collective inability of Europeans to address these questions that made the European construct so vulnerable to external challenges. I mentioned the Eurozone crisis, but think of the migration crisis, the crisis of EU-Russia relationship, and they matter a great deal right now to many Poles and Europeans. Lukashenko, of course, the Belarusian dictator, knows that too well and is exploiting Europe's weakness at Poland's eastern borders right now. So I'll just finish the opening statement by stressing that Poland's problems are indeed Europe's problems too, and need to be addressed as such. Thank you.
Wow, that was 14 seconds before kind of your 6 minutes ended. So that was really in time. Gerald, so now I set the timer again to 6 minutes, and it's up to you to respond. And maybe before you do, I already give a hint to our audience. So after that, you will have, of course, the opportunity to question everything that has been said and to challenge the speakers. That's the whole point of this debate. I'll do this too. I have some questions prepared, but if you want to come in, please write your question in the Q&A chat box, and then we come to them. But first, Gerald, your 6 minutes start now and shoot.
Thanks a lot, Jana. Thanks a lot, Stefan, for the chance to debate such an important, indeed crucial issue today. The European Union stands on the brink of a catastrophic development. What we are likely to see if the leading institutions miscalculate is the emergence of the first truly authoritarian state as a member of the European Union, something we've seen in recent years already happening in the Council of Europe. And the real issue at debate is one on which I'm sure Stefan and I will not disagree, but which he hasn't talked about very much, which is whether it is acceptable in an EU member state to have a Minister of Justice who controls everything that happens in all the courtrooms in his country. Poland has created in the last 6 years systematically a system that is unique. No other member state in the history of the EU ever created such a system of executive control of judges. Not Hungary, not Malta, not Bulgaria. The Polish Minister of Justice, Mr. Ziobro, whose name is amazingly little mentioned in these debates. He wasn't mentioned in the European Parliament debate on Poland, except by one Polish speaker. But he is not only the major beneficiary, he's also the most dangerous man in Polish politics today, because he holds hostage the government, the country, and the European Union. This Minister of Justice is the chief prosecutor who controls every prosecutor in the country, gives them instructions, sends them off against political enemies. This Minister of Justice can appoint and dismiss any court president in all of Poland's courts, and he's using this power. This Minister of Justice has created a disciplinary system that is unique in Europe and that is only to be found in Hugo Chavez's Venezuela or indeed in other autocratic states, where he can send disciplinary officers against any judge who rules in a way that he doesn't like. And why is this so shocking? Because the pretense that this is about defending Polish sovereignty or Polish courts is so obviously wrong that anybody who's looked at what happened in Poland in the last 4 years would immediately see through this argument. Let's just remind ourselves that Mr. Ziobro, the Minister of Justice, in coalition with the leader of PiS, Kaczynski, have attacked the Polish Constitutional Court unlawfully in 2016. And everybody knows that when you tell a Constitutional Court its decisions cannot be published in the official gazette, that is crossing a red line. He has attacked the Polish Supreme Court, a Polish court, when it applied EU law in 2019. He didn't defend Polish courts, he attacked them. And he is attacking the Polish Supreme Court today, even though the president of that court has been a former deputy of his in the Ministry of Justice and has been appointed by PiS. Because he's not interested in fighting communist judges or liberal judges or leftist judges, as he has pretended. He is interested in fighting independent judges. So let me just tell you this one example, then we see what we are really talking about. The president of the Supreme Court of Poland, Mrs. Manowska, dared in July to hint and then act on the judgment of the European Court of Justice from the 15th of July, which found a structural breakdown in the Polish judiciary, and a previous order that called on the disciplinary chamber, which is one of the elements, not the only one, of the disciplinary system to control all judges. She dared to suspend this disciplinary chamber. She was appointed by PiS. What was the reaction of Mr. Ziobro? It was to attack her viciously, to say that, and I quote, "A person who has decided to perform the function of first president of the Supreme Court should be resistant to threats from foreign institutions." Unfortunately, she was not able to meet this challenge. He accused her because she decided differently to him. And what was the next step? He met with Mr. Kaczynski and decided to strip the Supreme Court in a massive reform that is already being planned of all of its powers, or most of them, to reappoint all judges in the country and to come closer to his target goal of controlling everything that happens in the courtrooms in Poland. Now, Mr. Morawiecki, who's gone to Brussels, is in a very unfortunate position. Mr. Ziobro controls the votes without which the government of Mr. Morawiecki will fall. He knows that the Polish people, the Polish public, wants the EU funding. He knows that the Polish public is pro-EU, and he knows that Mr. Ziobro's position is a minority position. But Mr. Ziobro has one very strong argument, and he's used it and he's given it in interviews. For example, on the 6th of August, he said, if we ignore the European Court of Justice, as we have done in the last few years with the Council of Europe, with the European Commission, with the Venice Commission, with everyone who said that our legal reform is unacceptable, if we just ignore it, the money will come anyways. And this is why the European Union needs to stand strongly behind the two institutions that are to defend a core principle, that courts for Poles and for Europeans in every member state need to be independent. If we don't act on this now, if we don't act on this in the next days and weeks, it will be too late. Poland will have a politically controlled judiciary. Mr. Ziobro will be the most powerful man in the country. He can go after women's activists, after climate change activists. He can go after journalists, critics, business people, anybody he doesn't like. And there'll be no way to stop him. And this is why in this debate, Poland has no point.
Thank you very much to both. So we now go into the Q&A. I had asked previously also on Twitter whether there were questions, and we'll come to that, but I'll abuse my role as moderator to ask the first ones. And maybe please make sure that you divide the time more or less equally between you. So the first question actually is to Gerald. Gerald, so there is this argument that basically what the Poles are now saying is what the German Constitutional Court has said last year in June, and what other constitutional courts have previously said, the Danish, the French. So why is this case to you? Why is this different, or isn't it different? That would be my question to you.
Because we are not dealing with a question of a power grab by Brussels institutions. The instrument we are talking about here, the infringement procedure which led to the judgment of the European Court of Justice on the 15th of July. This and Mr. Ziobro are the two key elements in this debate. A judgment that is unique because it found that in a member state there's been a structural breakdown of access to justice because of all these reforms. The government controls what happens. This is unique. And there's never been a member state where this has happened. And it's not only European institutions that say that. The instrument being used, the infringement procedure, is not being used more often in recent years by the Commission. There are not more judgments by the European Court of Justice against member states. This image that there are these Brussels institutions out to control and subjugate member states just doesn't fit with reality. It is a unique case of Poland breaking the principles on which the EU is founded. And it is unfortunate that this is often not communicated clearly. When in the European Parliament, people talk about the rule of law crisis and throw Poland and Hungary together. No, there is no judgment on Hungary violating Article 19 of the treaty, which is about access, effective access to justice. It exists for Poland. So we should be very specific. And just one last point on what Stefan Auer said. This isn't about Germany and Poland. This is about Belgium and Poland, a founding member of the European Union. The Belgian president of the European Court of Justice, the Belgian prime ministers made very, very clear that they didn't create the European Union decades ago, providing stability, prosperity in a democratic and rule of law context, to now have Mr. Jobro and his ilk destroy it. So this is the battle.
Thank you. And now to Stefan, basically looking at the Polish verdict and compare it to others. Gerald said, and a lot of kind of legal scholars have made this argument, that the Polish judgment was indeed unique because it was really questioning the superiority of EU law in a kind of fundamental way. So my question to you is, if you say that this is acceptable, how can then the EU function without an efficient legal protective? So if every member state can now start questioning this, how is this whole system going to work in the future?
Let me just say that I'm not here to defend Ziobro. I understand that he's not even hugely popular in Poland. I don't need that. And I'm not defending the decision of the tribunal on its merits. It has issues. But it very much continues the logic that the German Constitutional Court, the entire edifice of the EU legal system was never as firmly established as many scholars of European integration pretended it to be. And that is now clear in the open. But I just want to make a key objection to a number of statements that Gerald uses for his perspective, and that is, the point is not that Ziobro is a fantastic justice minister. The point is how you want to address this crisis. And my key point is that you will not address it by the EU taking on competencies that it doesn't have, trying to solve the rule of law crisis in Poland by making its own rule of law crisis worse. Because that is what the EU has been doing. It has been taking competencies that it doesn't have. So the Polish problems can only be solved primarily by the people of Poland. And that is also the history of those nations of Central and Eastern Europe. This is one of the key differences, perhaps, that I can see between countries like my homeland, Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, Hungary, and the countries of Western Europe, that the very concept of sovereignty is not something to be overcome. Sovereignty, actually, national sovereignty is there to protect democracy, to make democracy work. So for Germans, and I agree, this is not about Germany and Poland, but for Germans, the perception of sovereignty is very different. And they just don't understand what's going on in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe because they are so attached to that post-national, post-sovereign Europe that they believe to be constructing. That Europe doesn't exist. It probably never existed. We have a Europe in which member states still are in charge. They are the masters of the treaties, right? And that remains the case. And that creates very serious difficulties when you have a country like Poland drifting away from the rule of law state. But to call Poland is authoritarian or dictatorship or whatever you want, I think it's unhelpful. I live in a place right now that would probably deserve that label because communist China is eroding whatever is left of the rule of law in Hong Kong. And when I say that here and now, I'm violating an existing law and I might be sacked from my position and whatnot. Poland is not a country like that. It has its difficulties. but it's not, in my view, comparable to Hong Kong, where I happen to live, or to Erdogan's Turkey, with which the EU negotiated an agreement to overcome its migration crisis, right? The problems that Poland has can only be addressed primarily by the Polish people, and are not going to be helped by punitive actions. And that is, I mean, Gerald, you proposed punitive actions to say that Poland should pay 5.2 billion euro annually before the Constitutional Tribunal even made that decision. So this is not going to win hearts and minds of Polish people for the European project, and to encourage them to replace the government. Polish people want to be in charge of who they are governed by, and the Polish government actually has much more popular support than many people in Western Europe want to acknowledge, I suppose.
There is a very good observation in the chat that you are basically arguing two different cases. So Stefan's case is structural and Gerald's case is topical, but we try to solve this now, maybe going a bit deeper into both of your arguments. So there is a question that comes actually from Sophie Pornschnegel. Stefan, could you give an example of how the EU has been taking over competences from Poland without the Polish government's agreement? Can you give her an example?
Yes, because we talk about judicial reforms and Gerald talked about it. Every government in post-89 Poland agreed that judicial reforms were necessary. And none of these governments managed to pursue them. In fact, it was Tusk government that pursued judicial reforms, and they tried to reduce the number of provincial courts. And the judges complained that it was against their independence. And they can complain effectively relying on EU structure. So I'm not saying they don't have a case, but the EU, you see, this is the EU sovereignty paradox. The EU has the power to stop Poland from doing this and that, but it doesn't enable it to do what it needs to do. So every country in post-communist world has a problem with judiciary and needed judicial reforms. This is not to justify the excesses of the PiS government, but that demand was very real. It was actually written in the constitution that Poland adopted. That constitution, incidentally, was adopted by post-communists, by Kwaśniewski, who said, we have our constitution, hooray. But that constitution envisaged judicial reforms that the judiciary didn't want, understandably, right? And so the EU has the power to prevent the member states from doing what they need to do, but there is no competency in EU treaties to supervise judicial reforms, of course.
Okay, I give that now to Gerald with the possibility to answer this. And Gerald, do you also, I mean, can you, what do you say in a kind of towards this idea that the ECJ has crossed basically a red line and has self-empowered, has taken on competences that it was never meant to have?
No, the ECJ is defending something that was taken for granted. What we've seen in recent years is that developments in certain countries can destroy the independence of courts if a political class is determined to do so. We are not talking about judicial reform. We are talking about a control of everything that will happen in courtrooms and punishment of judges through disciplinary procedures that are not taking the decisions that the government wants. And just to give you a sense, I don't know when you were last talking to Polish activists, Stefan, but if you talk to youth activists and youth climate strike, the Polish version of Fridays for Future, they are afraid because the government is attacking them verbally. They've had investigations. The prosecutors are controlled by Mr. Ziobro. But as long as the courts are independent, well, they can rely on the constitution, on the rights they have as citizens. The same is true for women activists that are protesting, for business people, for journalists. But the moment Mr. Ziobro, who can already control all the court presidents who have enormous power, the moment he can send disciplinary officials, and you'll know that his Ministry of Justice has already broken the law, has already made campaigns which led to one of his deputies having to resign, campaigns against judges, dirty campaigns. His goal is to subjugate every judge in the country. Now, in this situation, the European Union puts a choice before the Polish people. Okay. The European Union is supposed to accept other courts, other institutions in Europe are supposed to accept every judgment that is made by Polish judges. That's the recognition of judgments. That's the basis of a legal space. If Poland no longer has independent courts, if it's the Minister of Justice who can determine what happens, then other courts will not recognize Polish judgments. And that is already starting to happen. This would be a catastrophic situation for the European Union. It would break apart as a legal community because it is not an empire. It is based on voluntarily accepting common rules. So what it is doing now is put a choice to this government. And I'm convinced it will work if it just holds its nerve. If the Commission says, which it is empowered by the treaty, that it will go back to the European Court of Justice, as it has announced on the 20th of July, if Poland does not fully implement the judgment from the 15th of July and reshape the disciplinary system. If Poland doesn't do that, the Commission goes back to the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice imposes a sanction. It is allowed to do so and has been for decades. And it is allowed to choose a sanction that ensures compliance. That's the point of a sanction. It's not a little tax you pay and then you break the law. It's supposed to change behavior. And if it does so, I am convinced that the majority of the Polish public, we will see, will insist that this judgment is implemented. And if they don't, well, then it's up to Polish sovereignty, but then the European Union, Belgium and other countries are not required to accept this. Then they will say our money will not go to Poland.
May I?
Maybe, yeah, but maybe just 30 seconds, because we have so many questions that I want to continue getting answers to them. So, but Stefan, 30 seconds.
Just very brief, it's not me who says that the European Court of Justice has taken too much power. It's the German Constitutional Court that described its decision last year, Schlechterdings nicht nachvollziehbar. That is a decision that was beyond anyone's comprehension, which is a kind of language you would use to a court that is a dodgy court. And that was German Constitutional Court criticizing the European Court of Justice. So there is a European rule of law crisis that cannot be separated, divorced from the Polish rule of law crisis, and ignoring the first one is not helping in addressing the second one. And punishing Poland with withdrawing, for example, the Future Generation Fund, the EU has no authority to do that, because that instrument is there to prevent corrupt spending of those funds. There are half a dozen of countries who are demonstrably more corrupt, have higher problems with corruption than Poland. Think of my homeland, Slovakia, where a journalist was murdered because he investigated corruption. I don't know of similar case in Poland.
So let's pause this here. I think on the question, kind of comparison between the German verdict and the Polish verdict, there is a whole article on Verfassungsblog that I recommend here. I think the Polish Constitutional Court never questioned the superiority of EU law as such, but but there is certainly, there is certainly a connection, and the German verdict paved the way to the Polish verdict. But I'll go back now into my role as a moderator, because there were several questions about action, and one also about the future German government. And this is not about glass-ball reading here, but if Stefan and Gerald, you would have 30 seconds to advise the new German government what to do with Poland in this situation. We are now beyond Merkel. What would be your advice? And then maybe you can add whether you think this is going to happen with the traffic light coalition or not. And we start with Gerald. What would be your advice?
I would recommend to the German government to do nothing except back the European institutions that are required to act here. It is not the Council, it is the Commission and the European Court of Justice which have the mandate. And the Commission has already announced what it will do on the 20th of July. If it steps back and doesn't take Poland now to back to the European Court of Justice, it will lose all faith, all trust, and the infringement procedure is dead. The European Court of Justice is the institution empowered to act. Poland can always withdraw. I'm sure it will not, because in fact, this is in the interest of the majority of Poles. Stefan talked about democracy and majorities. You know that when PiS was elected and started with these dramatic judicial reforms, taking on the Constitutional Court, it had the support of 1 in 8 Polish eligible voters. It won 37% of the vote in 2015, and half the Poles didn't vote. So it didn't have a mandate for drastic constitutional change, which is what it has implemented. It had a mandate to govern within the rules. But dictatorship by majority and subjugating all independent institutions is not what the rule of law in the EU treaties is all about.
Now, the people of Poland had 5 more opportunities to vote, and each time PiS actually received the majority, and the opinion polls show that they have as much support as they had then. But you did something, if you don't mind, I'll finish my point. You did something that's very German, if you allow me to say that. That is to
I'm not German.
No.
But we let him finish.
I'm not saying that you are German. My name is German. I'm a Germanophile. But to cite my friend Hans Kudnany, who wrote about the paradox of German power, Germans are very keen to understate their power, but doesn't help anyone. So for you advise the German government to say, oh, you don't say anything, the Commission does its job, then you are presenting a view of the EU that is completely unrealistic. Of course, member states have power, and Germany is the largest and most powerful member state. That doesn't mean that Germany runs everything, but Germany's view matter in this crisis. And there, surprisingly, I am actually on the side of Angela Merkel, and I'm on record criticizing her for any number of things. I published a journal article criticizing Merkel, but Merkel's suggestion to pursue dialogue is the only one that pursue. And I will actually take the advantage of Hans' question to address both points. What if both perspectives are correct? And this is what my pro-EU friends refuse to even contemplate, that the Polish rule of law crisis is very serious and real, but the EU's rule of law crisis is also very serious and real, and the EU is not in a position to change the Polish situation without undermining its own rule of law. The EU has no authority to conduct judicial reforms in Poland, and the EU has no capacity or authority to withdraw these future generation funds, because there will be no future generation funds without Polish participation, and half a dozen of countries is way more problematic in terms of how they spend EU funding than Poland. So this is the dilemma we have, and to not to be able to acknowledge that it is a dilemma is what drives me insane, to be perfectly honest. So my task should be very easy. Poland has 8 points. I'm not defending the government. I'm not defending Ziobro. I'm just telling you that the EU has a problem too. That is not of making of this Polish government. The Polish government just makes it more intractable. But if we don't recognize that the EU has a problem, that the German Constitutional Court identified, that generated pushbacks everywhere. Look at the French presidential elections, where nobody, apart from Macron, still maintains the importance of EU's judicial, supremacy. That is a challenge, and that is an old, well-established member state. I presume you are not calling France an authoritarian regime yet.
So, Gerald, there is one question to you by Marek Czikotsky asking, how is it possible that so many courts in Poland rule against the authoritarian regime, which controls presumably everything in Poland? So I guess this is a question whether there aren't kind of indicators that the rule of law functions still in Poland.
Well, that's a very good question, because what it shows us is the real struggle, the real fight that has been ongoing. Whenever Polish courts have done what courts are supposed to do and have arrived at independent judgments, and Polish courts, they were punished for it. When the Constitutional Tribunal ruled that things the government did in 2016 were unlawful, against the constitution, the government resorted to the most authoritarian trick imaginable. It just said, this judgment will not be published. I mean, this was a coup, a constitutional coup in 2016. When the Supreme Court issued a judgment in 2019, the highest court in the land, the government just dismissed it. The government had a mandate to govern. Yes, it won elections, but that doesn't mean it has the mandate to just ignore all checks and balances. And judges that have ruled against Poland have been punished, including those that were appointed by the government. I give you just one example for how Poland is turning into an autocratic state. When Minister of Justice Ziobro didn't like a decision by the disciplinary chamber created by his government, with 12 judges chosen by his government, but they didn't agree to lift the immunity of one judge he really didn't like. but there was no basis to the case. Okay, so you can say, great, it works. He appointed judges, they defended her. When they did that, Jobro went on television and attacked these two judges personally. He said they were shamelessly putting unworthy corporate interests above the law. The judicial community is incapable of self-cleaning. We must fight the evil and pathologies. He's talking about judges he appointed. And what was his reaction now? He will dismiss, he will get rid of the disciplinary chamber and create an even more direct control, which he's already outlined, of all the judges in the country. So the point is this isn't about defending Polish courts. It isn't about defending sovereignty. It isn't about defending the rule of law. It is about defending autocratic power of a man that even his ministerial colleagues in Poland are afraid of. That is not about democracy. That is about a country sliding into autocracy. And if this is not stopped in the next weeks by a courageous commission, there will be political prisoners in Poland in 2 years from now. I guarantee you that, and we don't want to see that.
Thank you. Stefan, there is a question by Patricia Barreto. She asks, why do you believe that democracy can only be effectively protected by national judicial systems? And do you fear that the EU is not a democratic organization whenever it acts within the scope of its competencies?
That is exactly the point. When it acts beyond the scope of its competency, it has no mandate to do so. And what Gerald just suggested, I mean, with all respect, Ursula von der Leyen is not going to save democracy in Poland. This is the point. This is exactly the point. And I mean, we just talk about Jobro and the courts and all that, and these issues are very real. But I am asking you who and how can address these problems. And I continue to believe that only Polish people can do so. Let me quote you a friend who doesn't agree with me on many issues in Poland. He knows way more about Poland than I do. Professor Martin Krieger. He made the point, a simple point, repeatedly, that I think it's relevant here, that the rule of law is way too important to be left to judges and to courts. However distinguished those judges might be, however accomplished these courts can be. But this is what the EU is doing. It exacerbates the situation. How can people in Poland trust any court now when the European Court of Justice tells them, or the European Court of Human Rights, that this court or that court or this judge or that judge are illegitimate? So what this creates is cynicism. And the kind of cynicism that all these post-revolutionary societies have had to struggle with. Like, imagine how to rebuild or build from scratch a legal system that is somehow compatible with the rule of law state. These countries are communist. So the judiciary was subjugated to communist power, and the judges after 89 indeed were mostly part of the communist establishment. That's not the case today, of course. It's more than 30 years later, but the problems are very real. And Ursula von der Leyen will not march in with the European army to save Poles from themselves. Only Poles can do that. This is the key point. And the EU violating its own rules undermines its own rule of law crisis, and this exacerbates its own rule of law crisis while not helping Poland or itself.
So I have one last question to each of you. There is one from Elizabeth Nolan also to you, Stefan, and it links nicely to what you just said. So if nothing is done by the European Union, as you said, so that there is nothing that the EU can do, and it's about the Polish people. What are the potential implications for the Polish judicial system and the Polish people? Because you still count on kind of Polish democracy to solve this. But what if Gerald is right, or isn't there also maybe the possibility that Gerald is right and that kind of there is no kind of division of power in Poland any longer? And so, what happens to the Polish judicial system and the Polish people?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm very, very grateful because you allow me to qualify what I just said. I mean, to say that the EU can do nothing is massively overstated. So I was carried away in this debate. What I'm arguing against is these punitive actions, these fantasies of salvation, that you can starve Poles and then they will become perfect Democrats. It doesn't work like that. You create exactly the counter reaction. This is what we have seen actually in the EU's dealings with the UK, where we ended up with the hardest possible Brexit because the EU was being tough on the UK. The UK obviously contributed to it, but this is the kind of dynamic that I consider counterproductive. So I do believe And I do believe it precisely because of the kind of activists that Gerald you refer to. There is a thriving civil society in Poland. The public is well aware of what's going on. My friend Adam Czarnota argues that this constitution, this rule of law crisis, actually is turning Poles, is making Poles more aware of their constitution, and through that they are kind of taking ownership of it. When the constitution was adopted, no one registered that, right? It was an elite project. So I do believe that Poles can reclaim their democracy, but they're much less likely to succeed so when they just want to rely on punitive actions of the EU. And mind you, it's not me saying that. Listen to Donald Tusk, who argues against these punitive measures because he knows that they would undermine his prospects for re-election.
Thanks, Stefan. And you both have the occasion to make your final points and statements in a minute. But first, I want to ask Gerald a question that came in from Goran Buldioski. So if the verdicts of the Polish judiciary in the future are no longer recognized across the EU, and I think there has been a first case in Norway, so outside the EU, but still, what impact you see on the economy and the trade between Poland and other member states? So what are the consequences of this?
Well, we are entering completely uncharted territory because, of course, the European Union is a unique structure. It's not an empire. There is no army. There will never be one. That's a great thing. There isn't even a European Federal Bureau of Investigation. There are no national guards of the European Commission. It's all based on voluntary sovereign states coming together and agreeing to certain rules. It has thrived for decades and it has developed for decades because states have, in the end, after long negotiations in Brussels, long nights, weeks, months, lots of drama, and this is how politics should be. In the end, they agree to certain rules. But one of the most basic rules is that you need to be able to trust what national courts across the EU are deciding, because it will apply to any citizen. The European arrest warrant can mean that Polish courts, Polish prosecutors can get a Belgian sent to Poland to stand trial. This is unique in the world, and this is what has allowed the European Union to create a common market where rules apply everywhere, and you can be assured, or you can trust, that overall judicial systems will decide independently of the governments of the day. If this disappears, the European Union enters, and it's not me who says this, it is the European Court of Justice and its president, Koen Leenaerts, a Belgian constitutionalist who is certainly not in favor of creating a European powerful superstate. Belgians are not in favor of creating superstates. But he says clearly the European Union's founding principle will erode. And then if other states, there are some that might be tempted if Poland succeeds, if Szopło succeeds to control the judiciary, if other states follow down this road, the European Union cannot survive. And this is why Belgium and other countries that set up this union decades ago are so concerned. This is why this divergence, it is not about communist judges, which is what Polish government told us all this time, until they appointed a former communist prosecutor who was in their party to the Constitutional Tribunal. It is not about effectiveness of the judiciary, which is a legitimate argument. But now they say the judiciary is less effective than ever. And it is not about the supremacy of EU law. It is a power grab by a Minister of Justice and his associates that wants to control what happens in the country and wants to use this to silence and repress domestic opposition.
Okay, so now 9 minutes left and a hell lot of unanswered questions. So my lessons learned from this first Europe debates debate is that we either need to extend the time, or I don't know, this is really a difficult issue. Anyhow, I think we now need to give our audience the opportunity to vote a second time. So we'll now do a second round of polling, and yeah, you're completely free. You can vote kind of the same way you did initially, or you can change your opinion, your mind, and we come to the result of the second poll at the very end of our of our debate. I now give each of you, I think, 3 minutes to make your final claims and your final pleas. And Stefan started the first round, so we start now with Gerald. Gerald, 3 minutes, and kind of what do you think is most important?
Well, let me start with a quote from Stefan when he said that Ziobro, quote, is not a fantastic justice minister. I think that sums up a complete misunderstanding of what is happening in Poland. No, he's not only not a fantastic justice minister, he's a threat to democracy. And if this project, his project, prevails, it will be above all the Poles, but the whole European Union that will suffer. What can the European Union do? It has very limited tools. I agree with those who think that, you know, the rule of law mechanism, vague talk about rule of law violations are not helpful, because in the end they go back to the council, and the council is a place where there should be compromise. This is how Europe works. But there are basic principles. That is why we have courts, and that's why we have the Commission as a guardian of the treaty, where compromise is not an option, because it undermines the common rules on which everything else is based. So I see a huge opportunity, and let's close with this. A huge opportunity for the European Union. If the Commission articulates clearly that the reason it acted here, and it doesn't, as I said, do more infringement procedures now than 10 years ago, but the reason it acted here is because something fundamental is at stake, that every time Article 19, the right to effective justice, is violated, and this is not then a political decision, but a decision by the Court of Justice, that in a country the judiciary is in such a bad state that you can no longer trust the courts. It's only been done for Poland, not for any other member state. If the Commission finds this, it will ask for fines up to 1% of GDP, not so that Poland has to pay it, but that Poland has to implement the judgment. The goal is not to pay the fine, is to say that within the next 2 months, the judgment of the 15th of July needs to be fully implemented. And if this is done, the rule of law with a very clear red line, a very simple principle, is protected across the whole EU for the next generation, because no member state will then dare to violate Article 19 and try to build a system like in Venezuela, like in Turkey, like in Russia, or the one that Mr. Ziobro is about to complete unless he's stopped now.
Thank you. You have actually 45 seconds left, but never mind.
This is amazing.
Stefan, maybe you can give us your final thoughts, and maybe also along Gerald's lines, showing us a way into the future. So Gerald basically told us how he thinks this can be dealt with and solved. If Gerald is wrong, what is the alternative? So is this solvable at all? And you have 3 minutes.
Well, I can see that I haven't convinced Gerald. I hope that I convinced someone in the audience, because the simple message I want to articulate is that both can be right. We have a very serious rule of law crisis in Poland and in the European Union. I don't need to defend Ziobro. If you want me to say he's a threatful, he's an appalling and a threat to democracy in Poland, I'm happy to subscribe to that. But the EU has its own problems that it will not solve by violating its own rules. It is done repeatedly. So I'm much less sanguine about your statement that the EU has flourished. It hasn't flourished for the last decade, that's for sure. My book is about it, actually, I recommend it. So when you say that it has flourished, I remind you of the German situation, where the German Constitutional Court made a decision that displeased the European Court of Justice, so much so that the European Commission started infringement proceedings against the German government. What is the German government to do? Is it to discipline its own constitutional court, which would obviously violate its independence? It would subjugate it to the political will, to the political process. So that is a massive crisis of the rule of law that is happening within the EU. So we have this dangerous dynamic where the Polish rule of law crisis, caused by its attempt, the government attempt to subjugate the judiciary, is meant to be solved by legal means that would in their own right undermine the EU's rule of law. So no, I say no. And that is why the questions about sovereignty, the questions of the limits of EU power are very relevant. They are at the heart of it. You can't ignore them. They are difficult to disentangle from the rhetoric of the Polish government and its attempt to diffuse from its own domestic problems. But even that, to be perfectly honest, I see perfectly mirrored on both sides. That is, the Polish government seeks to deflect the attention from the very serious problems with pandemic, with inflation, with migration. The EU is trying to deflect from very serious problems. What is the EU doing in relation to Russia and Belarus? Nothing. What is the EU doing about the challenge of China? Nothing. It is busy disciplining and punishing one of its member states. Well, good luck with that. Polish democracy can only be maintained, saved, and safeguarded by Poles. And sure, the EU plays a role. It is an important supranational institution that has its own dimension to it, but it will not prevail by punishing the Poles and forcing them to the outcomes that we might want to see.
Thank you very much. 6 seconds left. I think we are facing a perfect dilemma, maybe, if both of you have actually a point, then it's what Hans Kundnani has written in the chat previously. So peace is becoming a fully fledged authoritarian, or is making Poland a fully fledged authoritarian state and a threat to the EU, but still the EU cannot do anything about it without exacerbating its own rule of law crisis. I think that is what we are left with. Yeah, let's see what our audience thinks. I don't know, can you see this? Otherwise, I think we need to, maybe one can share the results in the chat. It's actually, so the question was, rule of law, does Poland have a point? Yes, Poland has a point, still 26% of the people, so no change here. 63% think no, Poland doesn't have a point. So Gerald managed to flip 5% of our audience on his side. And this is the 5% that has previously been undecided or that wasn't sure, didn't know. So in terms of kind of who had the bigger impact on our audience, I think that was Gerald. Me personally, I think that we raised a lot of tricky and difficult questions, and I'm actually quite, maybe because also the many unanswered questions. I hope that we can continue this debate. I think, and I'm sure that there is a need to continue this debate because unfortunately, I see Poland not being willing to make any compromises at the moment, but to escalate the situation further, also when it comes to the reform of the judiciary. But this is my not so objective opinion here. So for now, Gerald, congratulations, 5% win. Stefan, I think you also made a quite challenging and convincing argument. I hope that we can at least take from this debate that these things can be debated, I think, in a respectful and straightforward, frank, controversial manner, but that we can still discuss. And yeah, we need to watch closely now what the Commission does, what the new German government does. And I hope that you will, join us soon for one of our events. Thank you very much to both speakers for taking the time and for engaging in this discussion.